Welcome! Check out the safety tips and be sure to subscribe to the channel right here. Thanks for watching.
Hello everyone. I'm Eric, the workplace safety guy. It was an ordinary Tuesday. The sun hadn't fully cleared the horizon when Marcus walked into that factory for the first time. 26 years old. Father of two. A maintenance mechanic just 3 months into the job at a manufacturing plant in rural Ohio. He had the easy smile of someone who believes that working hard enough keeps the bad things away. He carried the quiet confidence of a man who had never watched a factory floor take something from you that can never be given back. That morning, the production line had stopped. A jammed belt. Routine. 10 minutes, they said. Marcus grabbed his tools. Walked over to the machine. Looked at it. The machine was silent. And it is right there, in that deceptive silence, that the most important story you will hear today begins. Because the silence of an industrial machine does not mean it is dead. It only means you haven't heard it yet. The energy was still there, coiled, waiting. Hydraulic. Electrical. Kinetic. A time bomb wrapped in steel, wearing the reassuring face of something inert. Marcus didn't know that. Not because he was careless. Not because he was irresponsible. But because no one had ever sat down with him, looked him in the eyes, and said, Marcus, a machine that's been shut off can still kill you. What happened in the seconds that followed changed the life of an entire family forever. And what you are about to discover in this script will change the way you see every electrical panel, every conveyor belt, every emergency stop button on a factory floor, permanently. Because OSHA's numbers are terrifying, but numbers never tell the whole story. They don't have names. They don't have children. They don't carry the smell of the morning coffee Marcus drank for the last time without knowing it was the last one before the accident. Stay until the end. Because what comes next isn't just about safety. It's about what happens when an entire system fails a person before they ever had a fighting chance. If you work in a plant, in management, or in training, share this. The next Marcus might be reading this right now. In 1970, the United States Congress did something unusual. It acknowledged publicly that American workers were dying at an industrial scale, not in wars, but inside the very factories, warehouses, platforms, and job sites that powered the world's largest economy. The result was the Occupational Safety and Health Act. The birth of OSHA. The idea was revolutionary in its simplicity. If a hazard exists in the workplace, the employer has an obligation to eliminate it, control it, or at the very minimum, train the worker to survive it. Not as a favor. Not as internal policy. As federal law. More than 50 years have passed since then. And the numbers from 2024 are still staggering. OSHA recorded more than 2,655 violations related to the control of hazardous energy alone, what the industry calls LOTO, Lockout/Tagout, in fiscal year 2024. That means more than 2,600 times an inspector found a worker exposed to the exact kind of danger that nearly killed Marcus. 50 years later. 2,600 times. But to understand why that number persists, you first need to understand what LOTO is and why it exists. Not as a textbook definition, but as the answer to a real tragedy. The story begins in the 1970s and 80s, when industrial accident reports started accumulating a deeply disturbing pattern. Workers injured during equipment maintenance. Not through obvious carelessness. Not through intoxication or gross inattention. But through an invisible problem. The energy powering the machines didn't disappear when the button was switched off. Think about a hydraulic press. When you cut the power supply, the pressure stored in the hydraulic cylinders doesn't go anywhere immediately. It sits there compressed, waiting for any mechanical disturbance to release its full force in a single instant. It is the energy equivalent of a spring coiled to its maximum tension. Invisible to someone looking from the outside. Fatal to someone reaching inside. That is exactly what OSHA documented repeatedly in its accident files. Workers who had shut off the electrical panel, who had watched the machine stop, who believed in good faith that the equipment was dead, and who, during maintenance, triggered an energy release they never expected to find. Standard 29 CFR 1910. 147 was born from that. The control of hazardous energy. The federal requirement that before any equipment maintenance begins, every energy source must be isolated, physically locked with a device, and tagged with the identity of the person who applied the lock. That residual energy must be discharged in a controlled manner. That the absence of energy must be actively verified, not merely assumed. And here's the detail that changes everything: actively verified. Switching the key off is not enough. Watching the machine stop is not enough. The standard requires the worker to attempt to restart the equipment after applying the lockout, to confirm the energy is actually gone. One simple test. 1 second of deliberate attention that can be the difference between going home at 5 in the afternoon or leaving in an ambulance. Marcus knew none of this. 3 months on the job. A 2-day onboarding that covered uniforms, schedules, benefits, and HR procedures. A 40-minute PowerPoint presentation on general safety that never once used the words residual energy. He had watched more experienced coworkers do quick maintenance without any formal procedure. In a high-pressure production environment, with supervisors pushing for speed, the shortcut had become habit. And habit, on a factory floor, is the most powerful unwritten rule there is. But as Marcus walked toward that jammed belt on a Tuesday morning, he had no idea he was about to meet the cruelest version of the shortcut, the one that seems to work right up to the exact moment it doesn't. What happened next was not an accident. It was a system failing a person who never had the chance to protect himself. And if you think this story is about Marcus, you haven't understood it yet. Because Marcus is not an isolated case. He is the pattern. He is what happens when a company places a worker in a position of risk without equipping him with the knowledge that federal law explicitly demands. OSHA estimates that proper compliance with LOTO standards could prevent approximately 120 deaths and 50,000 serious injuries in the United States every single year. 50,000 people. The population of a mid-sized American city. 50,000 stories with names, addresses, families waiting by the door at dinner time. That number is not going down. And the reason it isn't going down will surprise you. Because the problem is almost never the absence of written rules. Nearly every company has a documented LOTO procedure sitting in a drawer somewhere. The problem is the chasm between what's on paper and what actually happens on the shop floor. It is the production pressure that causes a supervisor to say nothing and communicate everything, with a single glance that there is no time for full procedures. It is the culture where the fastest worker is the most valued, and the most careful worker is the slowest. It is the training that happens once at hire and is never revisited, as if risk had a 3-month expiration date and became harmless after that. Marcus was inside that culture without knowing he was inside it. And when he put his hands on that belt, the machine was not dead. It was waiting. What happened when that hydraulic pressure released will completely change your understanding of what we call a workplace accident. That's coming in the next part. The hydraulic pressure stored in that press cylinder was the equivalent of more than 175 pounds of force concentrated at a single point. When Marcus disturbed the belt, the automatic compensation system in the cylinder, still energized, responded in a fraction of a second. Before he could pull back, before his nervous system had time to process what was happening, the equipment moved. Marcus survived. But his right hand would never be the same. The investigation that followed revealed something the company would have preferred to keep hidden. There was no record of any formal LOTO training for Marcus. None. Not even the baseline required by Standard 29 CFR 1910. 147. The procedure existed on paper. It was filed away. It had never been verifiably transmitted to the worker who needed it most. OSHA levied fines totaling more than $280,000. But no dollar amount restores what was lost. And here Marcus's story connects to a statistic that needs to be said out loud. Between 43% and 76% of all machinery-related fatalities in the United States are directly tied to the failure to control hazardous energy. Not bad luck. Not unforeseeable accidents. A failure in a specific, documented, legally required procedure that was simply never passed on to the worker. This is not fatalism. It is a pattern. And patterns have causes. To understand the causes, you have to step into a different kind of factory. The factory of decisions that happens in management offices, far from the noise of the machines. In high-output production environments, machine downtime is money lost in real time. Every minute the line stands still has a calculable cost. And when a manager looks at that equation, the temptation is to normalize the quick fix as an acceptable shortcut. Not explicitly. Never in writing. But in the shadows of a results-only culture where no one asks how you did it, only whether you did it. OSHA calls this normalization of deviance. It is what happens when unsafe practices are performed repeatedly, with no immediate visible consequences, until they become part of the routine. The worker who completes 20 maintenance tasks without a LOTO procedure and walks away unharmed builds, involuntarily, a false certainty, asterisk if it worked 20 times, it will work on the 21st. Asterisk. Until it doesn't. This exact phenomenon was documented in the case of a tire processing plant in southern Illinois in November 2021. 3 workers suffered serious injuries in 2 separate incidents within a matter of days, all connected to failures in energy control during maintenance. The last of the 3, a production manager, became trapped inside a thermoforming machine when the conveyor cycled automatically. The injuries were fatal. 3 people. 1 week. 1 industrial plant. The investigation revealed that the company had known for months that its LOTO procedures were inadequate. The failures had been identified, and nothing had been done. Our investigation found that the company performed maintenance operations with full knowledge that its inadequate and failing lockout/tagout procedures exposed workers to the risks of moving machine parts, said the OSHA area director in Columbus, Ohio. With full knowledge. That phrase is the most disturbing part of the entire report, because it transforms an accident into a choice. And choices have consequences, and responsible parties. But what makes this story even more complex is that training failures rarely emerge from explicit bad intent. They emerge from systemic gaps. From an onboarding process designed to be fast, not effective. From a training program that measures attendance, not comprehension. From supervisors who were never trained to recognize that their own urgency is being read by the team as permission to skip steps. OSHA is unambiguous on this point. Training is not the delivery of information. It is the verification of competence. The standard requires that workers not merely hear about LOTO, but demonstrate they understand how to apply it on their specific equipment, in their specific environment, facing the specific hazards they encounter every day. That is a very different thing from a slide with a diagram of a padlock. And this is where Maria's story begins. Maria worked in industrial cleaning at a chemical plant. For years, she mixed cleaning products without incident. Then the products changed. The supplier reformulated one of the disinfectants, and the new version had a serious chemical incompatibility with another product she used in sequence. No one told her. Not because the safety data sheet didn't exist. It did. It was filed in the supervisor's office, inside a plastic binder that had never been opened in Maria's presence. When the 2 products met in her bucket, the reaction released chlorine gas. Maria was hospitalized with chemical burns to her respiratory tract. Standard 29 CFR 1910. 1200, Hazard Communication, the second most cited OSHA violation in 2024, with nearly 3,000 recorded violations, exists for exactly this reason. To ensure that every worker handling hazardous chemical substances has real, verified, and comprehensible access to the risk information for that product. Not nominal access. Real access. Maria had nominal access. And the difference between nominal and real, in industrial chemistry, can be measured in days of hospitalization. But there is still a third story that must be told. The story of Carlos, who wore PP every single day. Religiously. Gloves and all. And who still got burned. Because there was one detail no one had ever explained to Carlos. And that detail is about to reveal the most subtle and most devastating failure in American workplace safety programs. That's coming in the next part. And what you're about to learn about PP will completely change the way you think about protection. Carlos wore gloves every day. Disposable latex gloves. The kind he saw distributed at the entrance to the warehouse every morning, in boxes with the company logo. The kind every one of his co-workers wore. The kind that appeared in the photographs inside the training materials he had received on his first day. What no one had told Carlos was that disposable latex gloves do not protect against organic solvents. The acid he handled every day, a high-concentration industrial cleaning agent, permeated the latex membrane within minutes. Not instantly. Slowly. Silently. While Carlos worked with complete confidence that he was protected, because he was wearing the right PP. He was not wearing the right PP. He was wearing the available PP. Those are very different concepts. And Standard 29 CFR 1910. 132, which governs the use of personal protective equipment, is absolutely rigorous about this distinction. The employer's obligation is not merely to provide PPE. It is to conduct a hazard assessment for each job function, identify the specific risks that worker faces, select the PPE that is appropriate for those specific hazards, and verify that the worker understands the limitations of the equipment they are using. Limitations. That word rarely appears in PPE training programs. There is extensive discussion of what the equipment protects against. Far less discussion of what it does not protect against. Carlos didn't know that latex gloves have a specific chemical resistance window that varies depending on the product. He didn't know that for high-concentration organic solvents, the proper choice would be thick nitrile or neoprene. He didn't know that the permeation time for the product he handled daily, as measured in laboratory conditions, was approximately 15 minutes for the latex on his hands. He worked 8-hour shifts. The burn Carlos sustained was not severe enough to require hospitalization, but it was severe enough to leave permanent scarring on the back of his hand and left wrist, and to keep him off the floor for 42 days. 42 days of workers' compensation the company paid, plus medical costs, plus the internal investigation, plus the eventual OSHA citation when the case was reported, plus the productivity loss of a team that had lost an experienced member for over a month. The National Safety Council calculated that the average cost of a serious workplace injury in the United States in 2023 was approximately $43,000. For fatalities, that figure rises to $1. 46 million when direct and indirect costs are included. Those numbers exist on a spreadsheet somewhere in the HR or finance department of every major American company. And yet OSHA listed PP among its most frequently cited violation categories for the 14th consecutive year. 14 years. This is not negligence. It is a structural pattern. And structural patterns have a root cause that goes beyond the factory, the warehouse, the shop floor. They are anchored in how companies understand, or fail to understand, what training actually means. Here is the distinction OSHA makes, and that very few companies genuinely internalize. Safety training is not an event. It is a continuous process. Most corporate safety programs were designed as events. There is the onboarding training. Perhaps an annual refresher. Perhaps a weekly safety briefing that lasts 15 minutes and that everyone has been conditioned to treat as a coffee break. But OSHA requires training to happen whenever a worker is exposed to a new hazard, regardless of whether they have 20 years with the company. Whenever equipment changes. Whenever procedures change. Whenever a performance review suggests a worker is not applying what they learned. Not presence. Demonstrated competence. And here's what most OSHA audits find in companies that believe themselves compliant. The documentation exists, the sign-in sheets exist, the slides exist. But when the auditor asks the worker to walk through the specific procedure for isolating the energy on the stamping press in Section 3, the silence that follows tells the real story. If it's not verifiably documented, it didn't happen. That is the standard used by every defense attorney and prosecutor in a workplace accident case. And it is devastating, because it means the company that believed it was protected will discover it wasn't, at exactly the worst possible moment. But there is something even more disturbing than the documented accidents. It is the near misses that are never reported. OSHA refers to these as near misses, and the standard is clear. Near-miss events must be investigated with the same rigor as actual accidents, because they are the most precise signal that the system is on the verge of failing. A worker who walks under a suspended load and isn't struck got lucky. But the conditions that made it possible, the frayed cable, the absent spotter, the breakdown in communication between the operator and the rigger, still exist. They will exist tomorrow. And the day after. Until the day the luck runs out. In a survey conducted with more than 500 American workers in 2024, only 1 in 10 reported feeling unsafe at their workplace. 90% said they felt safe. But the rate of serious accidents over that same period contradicts that perception of safety. This has a technical name in occupational psychology: risk normalization. When you perform a dangerous task repeatedly with no immediately visible consequences, your brain stops classifying it as dangerous. The risk ceases to be perceived. And what is not perceived is not reported, not trained for, not corrected. Until it is. Carlos, Maria, and Marcus were not negligent. They were normal. They were the average American worker who believes that if they've made it this far without getting hurt, they must be doing it right. But doing it right and doing it safe are, far more often than we admit, two completely different things. And the distance between them lives in one specific place: the quality of the training that worker received, or didn't. The story coming next is about what happens when a company decides to do things differently. When training stops being an event and starts being the language of the environment itself. And what that change, when it is genuine, is capable of doing to the numbers. To the names behind the numbers. The case coming up will reveal what separates a company with real safety excellence from a company that simply believes it has safety excellence. And the difference is simpler and more unsettling than you might expect. There is a manufacturing plant in the state of Michigan that, for 6 consecutive years, operated without a single fatality and with a recordable injury rate below 0. 4 per 100 workers. For an operation with over 800 employees running heavy, high-voltage machinery, that number is statistically improbable. OSHA visited that plant. Not to cite it, but to understand what was happening. What the inspectors found was not revolutionary technology. It was not equipment more sophisticated than the competition's. It was not a safety budget 10 times the industry average. It was a radically different philosophy about what it means to train. The plant safety director had arrived at the company after 20 years in another industry, where he had witnessed 2 fatal accidents. Both related to LOTO procedures that were never applied. In both cases, the worker had the document. They knew the procedure existed. They had simply never been trained in a way that made the procedure instinct. He rebuilt the training program around a single premise: if the worker cannot execute the procedure alone, on real equipment, under pressure, with an observer present, then they have not been trained.
No PowerPoints. No onboarding videos.
Every new worker spent an entire week alongside a certified safety professional, executing each procedure on the actual equipment they would be assigned to, repeating it until the execution was fluid, automatic, instinctive. And not only at higher. Every equipment change triggered a new hands-on training cycle. Every near miss generated a collective analysis, not to punish, but to understand. Every shift change began with a 3-minute review of the day's critical procedures. Training stopped being an event and became the language of the environment. The results were measured over 3 years of implementation. The rate of serious incidents fell by 78%. Unplanned machinery downtime dropped by 34%, because machines properly maintained by properly trained workers fail less often. The total cost of lost time injuries and workers' compensation fell enough to fully fund the expanded safety program within 2 years. Safety is not a cost. It is an investment with a measurable return. But there is something the numbers don't capture. And it is the most important part. There is a worker at that Michigan plant, a press operator named Daniel, who, in October of 2022, identified an irregularity in the hydraulic pressure system of his equipment during a pre-shift verification check. He stopped the line. He called maintenance. The system was inspected, and a failed valve was found that, had it released during operation, would have discharged enough pressure to cause serious or fatal injury to the operator. Daniel caught it because he had been trained to catch it. Because he knew what to look for. Because the training had transformed the safety inspection from a bureaucratic obligation into a professional reflex. And because someone, at some point, had invested real time and real attention in teaching him. This is the equation OSHA has been trying to communicate for more than 5 decades. Every properly trained worker is not only a protection for themselves. They are an active risk detection cell for everyone around them. They are a node in the safety network that, when it works, captures failures before they become tragedies. But the equation only works when the training is real. Real means built around a specific hazard, not a generic one. It means executed in the actual environment, with the actual equipment. It means verified through practical demonstration, not just a signature on an attendance sheet. It means continuously revisited, not filed away after the first day. It means treated as a management priority, not as the exclusive responsibility of the safety department. OSHA, across more than 50 years of data, has arrived at a conclusion the numbers confirm again and again. 80% to 90% of serious workplace accidents are caused by human error that could have been prevented with adequate training. 80 to 90%. That is not a pessimistic statistic about human nature. It is an optimistic one about the power of intervention. Because trainable human error is not a character flaw. It is a knowledge gap. And a knowledge gap can be filled. By any company. In any industry. With any budget, as long as the will to fill it is genuine and not merely performative. OSHA has trained over 5. 8 million workers in the last 5 years through its outreach programs. And the data shows that in every sector where the penetration of that training has increased, the rate of serious accidents has fallen in direct proportion. This is not coincidence. It is direct causation. But OSHA's training programs primarily reach workers who have already moved through the formal system. Those who are officially registered, those who work at companies large enough to have a compliance department. The harder truth is that the most vulnerable workers, temporary contractors, new migrants, those entering industrial environments for the first time with no formal background in the role, are exactly the ones with the least access to that training. And they are the ones who appear most frequently in OSHA's fatality reports. Marcus was one of them. Marcus went through 2 months of physical therapy. He partially recovered function in his right hand. He never returned to industrial maintenance. When asked, during an interview with a workplace safety organization, what he would tell workers just starting out in an industrial environment, he went quiet for a long moment before answering. Asterisk, that they shouldn't ask if they can do the maintenance. That they should ask how it's done right. And that they should not accept "there's no time right now" as an answer. Asterisk. There's no time right now. That phrase, spoken on any factory floor in any safety context, is always a lie. Because the time to do it right always existed. What didn't exist was the decision to make it a priority. And when the decision not to prioritize meets the hydraulic energy of a press, the outcome is irreversible. OSHA is not going away. The standards are not going away. The auditors are not going away. The $200, $300, $500,000 fines are not going away. What can disappear, with the right decision, are the accidents. Carlos's 42 days of lost work. Maria's chemical burns to her airways. The 2 supervisors who walked inside a petroleum pipeline without knowing someone had restarted the system 5 hours ahead of schedule. The names in the reports that have addresses, families, morning coffees, and children waiting by the door at 5 o'clock. Safety does not happen by accident. It happens when someone in a position to decide resolved that training for real was more important than training on paper. It happens when workers leave training knowing that a machine can be silent and still alive. It happens when Marcus doesn't have to learn that lesson in the most expensive way imaginable. If you manage a team, you have the power to change this now. Not tomorrow. Not in the next procedure review cycle. Now. With the simplest question that exists. Asterisk, does my team actually know what to do to go home in one piece today? Asterisk. If the answer is anything less than an absolute and verifiable yes, the next tragedy is already being built. And now you know. Share this with whoever makes training decisions at your company. A Marcus might be on the floor right now. What separates him from going home tonight is what you do in the next few hours. Subscribe. Hit the bell. And if you've lived a story like this, tell it in the comments. Your story might be the one that saves someone else's. When a machine goes quiet, it doesn't mean it's dead asterisk.